Hey, yo, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to the Drago Gaming YouTube channel. This is SmartTCG from Team Drago Gaming, also currently the #2 ranked player in North America. Today, I'm going to be going over my Toronto on tier list. Now, Toronto is expected to be one of the biggest regional championships of the year. Today, I'm going to be going over where I think the current metagame stands. This is a wide open metagame with so many different decks currently in the standard format that have a chance to compete. Definitely one of the most diverse ones that we've seen in quite some time. So today, I'm going to be going over where I think it stands, and let me know what you think of it in the comments and where I put certain decks, or if there was anything that I potentially missed. But anyways, if you enjoyed the content, make sure to leave a like and subscribe, and let's hop right into it here. So these are the decks that we're going to be going over. I will also go over Terapagos as well, as that is not mentioned, so I'll make sure to add that to the end. But anyways, these are the majority of the top decks in the format, decks that see the most amount of play. So we got tier S, tier A, B, C, and D. I will say that there's probably not going to be a tier S deck, just because I don't think there's any deck that is far and away the strongest deck in the format. I feel like a lot of decks are relatively close. So let's hop into it here. I'm going to start off with some decks that have been most recently seen some success, definitely some big surprises. And we're going to start off with Dragapult Iron Thorns. Dragapult Iron Thorns is a deck that has been seeing quite a bit of success. Got top 8 at Stuttgart. Also saw success at Perth as well. Relatively easy deck to play. That's one of the nice things is that its strategies are relatively easy to pick up. So if you're a player who doesn't necessarily have a whole lot of time to prepare for this tournament and wants a deck that is relatively straightforward, then I do think that Dragapult Iron Thorns makes a good choice. It has a pretty decent Charizard matchup from my testing. Charizard does have a chance against it, especially if they do play Canceling Cologne. The matchup is actually quite close. Regidrago matchup is decent as well if you can buy enough time with that Iron Thorns to then go into Dragapult. So I think you do pretty okay versus those. And yeah, I think your matchup spread overall is relatively balanced. I think it's a pretty solid deck overall. I will say the one thing that holds it back is its consistency. I will say that sometimes those first couple turns are just brutal for the deck. So that is one thing, because you don't necessarily play a whole lot of draw support. You play a heavy count of something like Crispin, which doesn't actually draw you cards. So if you draw into too many of those early game and you just don't have great draw support, or your deck can kind of just fall apart. So that's really one of the things that kind of holds this deck back. So next up here, let's go over some of the other decks that have been kind of surprising people. Miraidon most recently won the Sacramento Regional Championships and also got second. Landon Caitlin was able to take Sacramento down. I think it's a pretty decent deck. The reason I'm putting it in tier B and not tier A is that its most recent performances at Stuttgart and Perth right after Sacramento weren't necessarily very impressive. The deck definitely struggled at those tournaments as the metagame kind of adjusted more towards a heavy Charizard format. However, matchup against Zard is definitely winnable. I do think your Regidrago matchup as well is pretty good. I will say at least 55-45 to 60-40. I do think you are pretty good against that matchup too, which is a big selling point for the Miraidon. So that's also pretty big too. But yeah, overall it's a good deck. In my opinion, the strongest of the turbo decks in the format, just because it's a turbo deck that isn't necessarily the most linear deck in the world. Something like Raging Bolt is very predictable. Raging Bolt, Roaring Moon as well. Those decks kind of struggle to the one prize decks in the format, whereas Miraidon has a little bit more versatility because you have access to things like Iron Hands, which is definitely very, very nice. So yeah, Miraidon definitely very solid, good deck currently in the format. Next up here, we got Raging Bolt. I'm just gonna do all the turbo decks first for anyone who wants to know where I think the turbo decks are. I think that Raging Bolt, solid tier deck. Also got Turbo Roaring Moon, I think is a tier C deck. I think Bolt and Miraidon are both overall just a little bit better than Turbo Roaring Moon. Have a little bit better matchups against things like Regidrago. So I currently have those two. Next up here, we got Lost Zone Toolbox. Lost Zone Toolbox is a bottom of tier B deck. It just struggles to Regidrago, and your Charizard matchup isn't great, but you do decently versus some of the Iron Thorns decks. You can kind of just run them over. Your turbo matchups are pretty good, but you are held back quite a bit by the Drago and Zard matchup being pretty difficult. So that's one thing holding the deck back. Next up, we got Lugia. I think Lugia right now is a little bit underrated. I will say your Thorns matchups, both Quad Thorns and Dragapult Iron Thorns, are very, very tough. However, you do take decent matchups into Zard and also Regidrago, which is the biggest selling point for the deck, as I do think that you are slightly favored into both of those decks. You are pretty favored into Regidrago if they don't play Temple of Sinnoh, and I do think if you're able to set up, you are ever so slightly favored versus Charizard, which is really, really nice. You do relatively decently against some of the turbo decks like Raging Bull. Your Miraidon matchup is fine as long as you're able to get set up on the second turn. It's not great. I will say your Bolt matchup is, definitely better, but you're okay against it. And you're pretty decent versus a lot of other things. But yeah, your Thorns matchups are, definitely very, very rough. But your matchups against some of the top decks are pretty good. So I will say that's one of the selling points of the deck. Next up here, we got Ceruledge. I think Ceruledge is just worse Gholdengo. Hydreigon is just very inconsistent, but is a cool deck overall, but I don't think it has the legs right now to see success in a major tournament. Definitely might be a couple in day 2, but I think that's, potentially the limit right now until some, new cards. Next up, we got Cloth Terapagos. I think Cloth Terapagos is pretty good. It's been seeing a lot of success recently. I do think that the Zard and Drago matchup are both very close to potentially slightly unfavored. Kind of depends on exactly what those lists are choosing to play, exactly like what, type of tech cards, if, Zard is playing Collapse Stadium or not, if, Regidrago is playing, Temple of Sinnoh and potentially also Jamming Tower, which both, those cards can be going for, Cloth to deal with. So there's, kind of a couple things. I will say that one of Cloth's biggest issues is its consistency. Sometimes it just draws into these just complete mess of a hand. It plays a lot of cards that are very good once you're fully set up. However, sometimes you draw those cards before you get set up, and it kind of leads to some pretty chaotic hands that just don't work out. So, Cloth is definitely like pretty good. I will say your matchups against the top 2 or 3 decks are pretty close, but you do pretty good against a lot of the turbo decks. Raging Bolt matchups pretty good. Like your Miraidon matchups decent. Your Thorns matchups are okay. They're pretty decent overall. Your matchup against things like Snorlax and Control, because you have access to Petrant, is definitely relatively decent too. So you have some good matchups. You have some good matchups overall. Next up, we got Gholdengo. I think Gholdengo is a solid tier 2 deck, or this stance would be tier B. It's pretty decent. It got top 4 at LAIC, got top 4 at Sacramento. I will say that linearity is kind of the biggest thing that holds it back. Its Charizard matchup is not great unless you play Togekiss. That's really your best chance at beating Zard. I think if you don't play Togekiss, your matchup against Zard is just very, very difficult. But if you do play Togekiss and you flip, at least a heads or two, matchup's definitely a lot better. So I do think you're decent against Regidrago. That's one thing you have, going for it, is you're pretty decent into that matchup, especially if you go first and you get going and have an aggressive turn 2. I think your matchup is actually pretty favored into that. So yeah, I think that Gholdengo's decent right now. Next up, we got Quad Thorns. Quad Thorns, I think, is worse than Dragapult Iron Thorns. It did see success at Perth, but I like having access to Dragapult. Just gives you more flexibility and versatility. Throughout a long tournament, you're sometimes going to hit some weird decks potentially where Dragapult would be nice. So I personally prefer the Dragapult, but Quad Thorns does have a little bit of a better matchup against things like Charizard, for example. Because if the Dragapult Iron Thorns, starts Dreepy, or something like the Toad School, then they can get into Zard, they can get energies on the board and can become kind of scary. Whereas with Quad Thorns, that's not a concern. So also you have Crushing Hammers and Judge and stuff like that, which is very scary for Zard to deal with. So there is that too. But overall, I think Thorns with Dragapult's a little bit better. But I think that Quad Thorns is decent. Next up here, we got Drago. I'm just going to do Drago and Zard right now. I think Drago's the best deck in the formats. Not by a huge margin. I would say maybe a month or 2 ago, Regidrago would be nearing the S tier. But I think that, Regidrago at the moment, with, Miraidon seeing success, Gholdengo as well seeing success. I do think the deck gets a little bit more, checked right now, as it does have some more, pretty sketchy matchups, to kind of deal with. But Zard also seeing a resurgence is, I think, pretty decent for it, as your matchup against Zard is relatively good. I think that, heading into Zard's matchup spread is fantastic. Its matchup spread is very good overall versus a lot of decks in the format. You do take pretty rough matchups against the Thorns variants, and also Regidrago. That's, one matchup, that I expect to see a decent amount of if you're playing Zard, and that matchup feels about 40-60. So if you're able to get at least like a win or two against, Regidrago or tie Regidrago, it feels, really, really good. However, if you play against a bunch of them and you're not, really able to see a whole lot of success against them, then, kind of tournament. So that's, the big thing is if you can, beat the Drago or you can just dodge the Drago, Zard is broken because it's matchup spread against, I think the whole format is just really, really good because you have access to pretty much tech for anything. Canceling Cologne, Lost Vacuum, Collapse Stadium if you want. Definitely a lot of different tech cards that help out versus, a lot of different matchups. But Regidrago's not really a matchup you can really tech for except something like the Manaphy, but that doesn't fix really a whole lot of the problems that I feel like, kind of come up in that matchup from, Zard's, perspective. So overall, I think Zard's good, but you do have to accept you have rough matchups against Drago and some of the Thorns variants. You are much better against Drago Thorns because, kind of like as I said a little bit earlier, if you are able to get something like the Dreepy up and then use Rare Candy Charizard, it does kind of help out. And you can actually get like a board state going, whereas versus Iron Thorns, you have to find your canceling spots. Next up, we got Control variants, Pidgeot and Stall, both tier B. I like Stall a little bit better as I think it's better into Zard and Regidrago, whereas I feel like Pidgeot, if they play against teched out variants of these decks, that are really prepared, they can kind of just like get ran over. Whereas Snorlax is a little bit more resilient overall. So yeah, that's currently where I have them. Both kind of towards the bottom of tier B, but Snorlax a little bit ahead. Then last up, we have Gardevoir here. We'll also go over Terapagos too, as that's one more I want to add on to here. I don't know exactly why it wasn't on this, but I think Gardevoir is still, very, very solid. Most recently won the Perth Regional Championships. Very good against a lot of like these turbo decks, which is really, really nice. And your Charizard matchup and Regidrago matchup are very close, but you make it up by having a lot of really good matchups against like a lot of these decks. Your Bolt matchup's great. Your Cloth matchup's good. Cloth's gonna see play. Your matchup against the Thorns decks just in general, I think both of them you're pretty good against. So you have a lot of decent matchups, and your top arguably strongest two decks in the format being Regidrago and Charizard are both very, very close matchups. I will say though, if Charizard is playing Lost Vacuum, that does I think make Charizard favored just because they can take a huge 4 or 5 prize card turn on you where they use something like Lost Vacuum, they knock out the Drifloon Screamtail, then they pop a Dusknoir, and then they could potentially Briar KO an EX and take 5 prize cards in one turn. That can kind of be a problem, but if they don't play Vacuum, it's definitely a lot better for sure. Last up here, I wanted to go over Terapagos. I still think Terapagos is a decent deck. Terapagos. All right, there we go. Terapagos, I still think is a solid deck. I'm gonna put it in tier. I think tier B. I think it's still solid overall. I think you got to play Bouffalant. It's a decent deck. Your matchups against Drago and Charizard are both very close. If you do play Bouffalant, you do pretty good against the turbo decks overall. You're good versus Thorns. Your Cloth matchup's actually quite close. Some people think the matchup is bad, but if you actually play lots of games with it, it's actually quite close. And yeah, I think Turtles is still a decent deck. But anyways, that is going to do it for the video. Let me know what you think of the tier list. If there's any decks you felt like I missed, make sure to put those in comments. But anyways, thanks so much for all the support as always. I appreciate it. Thanks for tuning in. I'll be making some, videos here and there, hopefully channel. But anyways, thanks so much for all the support. This is SmartTCG. Speak to you guys again soon. All right. Peace out.